from, cutout cardboard to your more advanced 3D printed terrain.
And that right there, that is the crux of the issue. So the central question for us today is this: does this commitment to extreme universality, allowing any brand, any scale, and combining these wildly disparate forces, does it demand a level of abstraction that, fundamentally compromises strategic fidelity and core balance in high-level wargaming?
I see why you think that. But I'm going to argue that this radical universality is precisely the system's greatest strength. It promotes unparalleled accessibility and creative freedom, and all that freedom is successfully maintained by the really robust objective math that underpins its uniform point system.
And I, on the other hand, am going to contend that the inherent strategic specificity, the tactical realities of these different combatants, it all just gets lost. Or at the very least, it's overly diluted when you force it into that single universal mathematical cage. And that leads to some pretty critical compromises in strategic realism that, I think serious players are going to notice.
Okay, but let's focus first on why this universality is so successful. The goal, as it's stated, is to create a system that is timeless, promoting all brands of dioramas, models, and collectible figures. This open approach makes the hobby fundamentally more accessible. If you already own figures, whether they're fantasy, historical, or sci-fi, you can play. And the rule system, it manages this vast disparity in combatants because it treats every single unit, regardless of era, as a quantifiable data set.
A data set, yes, but that's my entire point. Data can't always capture strategic reality. I mean, when you try to compare, let's say, a simple Roman legionary to one of these future Dark Echelon's armored walkers, you have to abstract away so much era-specific tactical advantage that the resulting unit profile is just inevitably reductive.
But the detailed cost calculation is the genius here. It breaks down every relevant combat factor and assigns it a predictable, uniform point value. And when we talk about these factors, we need to be precise. It quantifies range and speed, of course, but also success rates like PR, or projectile roll success percentage, and CC, or close combat success percentage. It accounts for the required rolls to hit, the number of hits a unit has, and its endurance factor.
Even with that level of detail, I just don't buy that the cost calculation can truly encapsulate all of those strategic realities.
Well, I think it has to because it successfully handles the extremes. Just consider the point disparity. You have a monstrous 4,200-point red dragon being balanced against potentially hundreds of 9-point zombies. This system ensures mathematical parity across infantry, vehicles, monsters, and aircraft. And the fact that they include low-cost DIY and 3D printed scenography just reinforces the philosophy. Tactical play and game structure are prioritized over expensive proprietary materials or, uniform aesthetic choices.
That is a compelling argument on accessibility, I'll give you that. But let's shift to the physical compromises. The rules allow these wildly varied scales, from tiny 15mm up to imposing 54mm figures. And while the game uses fixed operational measurements, so a light infantry unit might have a 50-centimeter range and visibility in a forest is a fixed 20 centimeters, the sheer physical difference in miniature size and base footprint introduces a subjectivity that I think undermines strategic clarity.
Are you suggesting that a fixed rule can be broken just by the aesthetic size of the figure?
I'm suggesting that wargaming depends on visual and tactile clarity. A 54mm figure just has a much larger, more imposing visual presence than a 15mm figure. So when players are adjudicating line of sight, or checking if a unit is concealed in cover, that physical difference can, maybe unconsciously, affect their interpretation of the fixed rules. Even if the rules try to standardize bases, the figure itself dictates how a player visually interprets cover and exposure, and that could potentially favor the larger scales and subjective calls.
I think you're focusing a bit too much on visual aesthetics, rather than the miniature as a piece of, functional geometry that's dictated by its base and by the rules.
But the physical reality is part of the strategic calculation. And if the system is truly so universal, why does it have to rely on such a generalized, almost punitive mechanism like mutual hindrance? When you mix units from different eras or doctrines, critical factors like rolls, hits, ranges, extras, and speed are all reduced to the lowest values in the mixed unit. To me, that's an explicit admission that the system can't smoothly integrate these disparate forces and has to impose a heavy-handed universal penalty to keep things in equilibrium.
Well, that brings us right to the tension between the complex math and strategic depth. I still stand by the point calculation system as the objective equalizer.
Okay, but let's look closer at that objective calculation. The formula converts everything into an arithmetic value. How precisely does the system accurately weigh the value of, say, an ancient tactical formation, like the infantry formation ability which doubles the total CC percentage against the profound technological advantage represented by a future unit's powerful special ability, like the giant Necrohomunculus's overwhelming 3?
It achieves that through the use of complex multipliers, which are factored into a total base cost. This is the extras cost. The system doesn't just add numbers, it uses conditional multipliers for abilities like overwhelming, which represents the sheer force and destructive potential of a unit, allowing it to inflict 3 hits for every 1 successful attack roll.
Exactly. And that overwhelming ability is easy to calculate because it's a raw damage multiplier. But an ancient advantage, like the legionary formation, which requires 2 hits to inflict 1 effective hit, that's a defensive conditional advantage tied to unit cohesion. The formula tries to unify these highly specific qualitative advantages, one technological, one doctrinal, under a single simplified costing structure. Inevitably, the tactical depth of the higher tech or more specialized factions has to be, smoothed out just to fit the universal cost template.
I would argue that if the underlying mathematical engine is sound, and I believe it is, then the cost is the nuance. The system ensures that if 2 players field armies with the same total point cost, they stand an even chance. Whether one fields archers and the other fields space infantry, the mathematical quantification of their respective advantages means balance is preserved. And that is a monumental technical achievement, the ability to quantify and compare seemingly incomparable abilities across different fictional and historical settings.
I agree that the system is quantifiable, but that doesn't mean it retains strategic fidelity. And if we shift from the math to the physical table, the limitations become undeniable. We're dealing with a rule system that allows a player to field a small 15mm infantry unit right next to a towering 54mm futuristic mech. I mean, that presents logistical nightmares that go way beyond mathematical point costs.
But the rulebook is quite clear on this. Players choose scale based on their preference for quantity or visibility, recognizing that different scales offer different tactical experiences.
That acceptance, however, creates problems when determining critical visual factors like line of sight and cover. We've got rules that accept buildings and scenography made of cutout cardboard standing next to highly detailed, maybe 3D printed buildings. How does a player consistently determine cover and elevation when the fidelity and visual density of the terrain pieces vary so dramatically?
The rules elegantly navigate this by defining terrain functionally rather than aesthetically, and this is key to maintaining that accessibility we talked about.
That's an interesting point, but I'm not convinced that functionality can fully override visual confusion. Mixing scales and terrain qualities generates real visual ambiguity regarding coverage and maximum visibility that no simple rule can fully mitigate, despite the standardized base requirements. You're still going to have players arguing about whether a 54mm model's head is visible over a cardboard wall that was designed for a 28mm figure.
But the rules eliminate the need for those subjective calls by defining the function of the terrain element, regardless of how it looks. The rules specify the exact effects of terrain: impassable cover, passable cover, block type cover. If a piece of terrain functions as block type cover, its effect is fixed. For instance, having the projectile roll success rate. It doesn't matter if a barricade is resin, plastic, or a folded piece of card. Its effect on the game is non-negotiable.
So the game intentionally sacrifices aesthetic fidelity to ensure tactical consistency.
Precisely. This commitment to accessibility, using low-cost materials like coins or buttons as bases and providing DIY options, It confirms that the game values the tactical structure over expensive proprietary aesthetics. And the ability to incorporate 3D printed materials also shows the system is future-proofed and open to modern hobbyist practices. That commitment to any brand and any material is a huge win for the community.
We may disagree on whether that trade-off is strategically worthwhile, but let's delve deeper into the strategic constraints imposed by that universality. Specifically, I want to return to the mutual hindrance mechanic.
I see it as a necessary strategic constraint that reflects the realities of coordinating disparate forces.
But it acts as a universal dampener that actively punishes the very multi-temporal mix that the game promises. Let's just look at the movement constraint. The rule dictates that a mixed unit must take the lowest value for range, speed, rolls, hits, and extras. So if a player tries to combine a slow dwarf heavy infantry unit with a speed of 15 centimeters with a swift plains elf cavalry unit capable of 35 centimeters, the entire resulting unit moves at 15 centimeters.
Well, if a slow unit can't keep up with a fast unit, the overall movement speed must be limited. That's not a punishment. It's a strategic reality reflecting the difficulty of integrating forces with differing doctrines.
But the lack of granularity is the problem. It forces the lowest common denominator across all metrics, not just speed. It also affects their attack rolls and their range, meaning the futuristic elements are penalized back to the level of the least capable member in the unit. It's too generalized. It simplifies the strategic integration of a futuristic space marine working with medieval chivalry down to one harsh rule, and that effectively strips out the complexity that the multi-temporal setting ought to leverage.
Bid cooperation. It just makes it a sophisticated strategic choice. The system still allows for the mechanical pooling of success percentages. The projectile roll and close combat percentages can be added together, so the firepower is still maximized even if the unit is slower or less agile. This structure forces players to specialize units to maximize effectiveness, requiring thought about synergy rather than just creating some kind of super unit. Cooperation is possible, it's just strategically demanding, which is appropriate for a cooperative game fighting a mutual enemy.
I see that point. It forces unit homogeneity to preserve high metrics, but it also means that to play the game optimally, you are strongly incentivized not to mix eras, which seems to undermine the core sales pitch of the rules. The design compromises the strategic reward of combining different unit types for the sake of achieving universal compatibility.
I would frame it differently. The constraint is the challenge, and overcoming that challenge is the victory. The foundational mechanism successfully establishes a balanced baseline for conflict across any era, using any figures, which is, again, a monumental technical achievement for a cooperative wargame system that incorporates 3D prints and figures from 15mm to 54mm. And let's not forget, the rules explicitly allow for house rules. If a group feels the penalties are too harsh for their specific blend of forces, they have the tools to adjust them.
A monumental achievement in framework design, maybe, but one that undeniably sacrifices specific strategic fidelity in its pursuit of universal playability.
So, to summarize my position, the Semper Fidelis Alliance 3.0 system successfully prioritizes player accessibility and creative freedom. It enables the use of all eras, any brand, and incorporates modern materials like 3D prints, all by providing a fundamentally sound mathematical framework where quantified combat values ensure extreme diversity doesn't shatter the balance. The math is the solution.
And I'll reiterate that while the game is highly accessible and offers fantastic flexibility, players have to accept inherent limitations. The extreme universality requires abstracting or, smoothing over the critical, specialized strategic advantages that define different eras and unit types. So for players seeking high strategic fidelity within a specific historical or fictional context, the compromises made for this multi-temporal universality may just prove too broad and generalized.
Ultimately, whether one views these trade-offs as necessary compromises or as exciting creative opportunities, the rules offer a rich and complex foundation for exploring cooperative multi-temporal wargaming.
A complex foundation indeed, and one that offers plenty more to explore within this fascinating rule